As Vignesh pointed out, that the research that we pursue in our group is very interdisciplinary, and we are really trying to bridge the gap, going all the way from how you are designing your hardware for these AI systems, how can we rethink machine learning algorithms, and getting more insights from neuroscience. So hopefully I'll be able to give some snapshots of our research across different layers of the computing stack. So let me get started off by discussing the motivation behind the field really. So um, if you really look at the computational resource requirements that AI algorithms require, we all know that they have made significant progress over the past few years. But if you look at the number of flops required as a function of the year number, we are seeing that while for like in the pre-GPU computing era, the flop requirement was kind of following Moore's law. However, with GPUs, we are seeing that the flop requirement is doubling almost every 3.4 months, and especially if you look in the domain of natural language processing, you are almost doubling every 2 months. So therefore, the computational resource requirements are growing almost 12-fold faster than what Moore's law can support. So therefore, that's on one side the motivation as to why we need to revisit brain-inspired computing. On the other hand, if you look at brain simulations that people try to do to diagnose various brain diseases, if you were to simulate activity of even a cat's brain on the best possible supercomputer that we have, we would require orders of magnitude more power consumption. Now, in stark contrast, the human brain is requiring computation, like is requiring power, which is only of the order of a few tens of watts to do all the processing. So therefore, the motivation really behind the field of neuromorphic computing is to draw inspiration from various facets of how the brain works and imbibe those concepts into how you are redesigning your algorithms, your hardware substrate, your computer architecture, and so on. Before going into more details of my talk, I would like to really categorize computing, the artificial neural network computing generations into three particular categories. In initial days, people started working with perceptron networks, where you essentially have a set of inputs coming in. They get multiplied by synaptic weights, which are essentially junctions in the brain between neurons, and you have importance values associated with the various inputs. You do a dot product, and that goes on to your neuron for processing. Now, few things to highlight over here is that these synaptic weights therefore are memory elements, in the sense that I will need to remember what are the importance values of these various inputs. And the neuron is really the computing element, where depending on the input, I'm going to generate an outgoing information. Now, the accuracy of these networks was pretty limited, and therefore people quickly scaled this up to what I'm referring over here as analog neural networks, where the neurons were envisioned to have an analog response output, non-linear, with respect to your input. Now, this is currently the de facto standard for deep learning that we have today. Now, moving forward, from the analog neural networks, a large section of the computing model that neuromorphic computing works with are spiking neural networks. And the main key notion over there is, can we really model the neural and synaptic functionalities in the brain with a much higher degree of detail so that we can leverage its huge processing efficiency? So let me go into a bit details about how the spiking neural network works. So for instance, the key differences from standard deep learning networks is the fact that spiking networks operate over time. So there is the notion of temporal processing in spiking networks. Also, these are event driven systems, in the sense that you do computing only when you are being triggered by incoming spikes. So you see over here the state of the neuron, which is a membrane potential, integrates whenever you have an incoming spike. It leaks in the absence of a spike, and that kind of goes on till the membrane potential reaches a particular threshold, at which point you generate an outgoing spike. So why do we have an advantage over here? The reason being that if you think of implementing this in a hardware system, I now have a whole bunch of neurons that are only propagating information between them only when needed, and computing also occurs only when needed. So this kind of event-driven computation and communication has been leveraged to really implement sparse event-driven computing in various neuromorphic chips. Some of the key players today being Intel, Loihi, IBM, for instance, and so on. So given that we have this new kind of computational models, what are we really trying to solve? If you look at current deep learning, there are several algorithmic challenges. For instance, many a times we just end up running things on GPUs and we really don't worry about the computational cost. But there are a host of applications, for instance, in this era of IoT, we really need to implement embedded intelligence in a whole bunch of edge applications where you will have resource constraints. Few examples being various AI apps on your mobile phones or AR, VR glasses and so on. So how can we be resource efficient? Can we be robust to adversarial noise? Can we minimize the amount of labeled data that we require during training? Can we have lifelong learning capacity in the sense that whenever I have an old task, the accuracy saturates, but whenever I have new incoming tasks, can I avoid catastrophic forgetting that is usually present in standard deep learning systems? In confidence critical applications like self-driving cars, can we get an uncertainty matrix from these networks? So there are these several challenges, and looking at more like much higher degree of biofidelity in the neural and synaptic computational models in the computing architecture can potentially enable us to bridge some of these gaps. So this is more or less from the algorithms. From the hardware side, if I look at the organization of CMOS implementation for these AI applications, I try to think of it from two perspectives. First of all, if you think of a computational block like a neuron or a synapse, if I am, let's say, trying to implement a synapse, I really need a 60 or an 80 SRAM cell per bit of the synapse, which means that, let's say, I do want to do 4 bits of implementation, I easily require 24 to 32 CMOS transistors. For a neuron implementation, similarly, you are looking at doing a dot product, so you'll need multipliers, adders, and therefore the computational overhead is significant. And primarily this is happening because CMOS transistors are on-off switches, and therefore they are very much suited to implementing Boolean logic type of implementation and may not inherently map to the computational primitives that we have in these systems. Now, interestingly enough, recent experiments in various emerging post-CMOS technologies, our group, for instance, specifically focuses on ferromagnetic and ferroelectric devices, where it is now possible to mimic some of these functionalities through the intrinsic device physics of these nanoelectronic devices at very low terminal voltages. For instance, you are seeing over here on the left, we have the leaky integrate fire characteristics of a spiking neuron, and on the right, we have a magnet essentially. And the magnet has a magnetization, and you can tap out the conductance of this nanomagnet. So if I were to trigger this by a set of incoming current pulses, which can represent spikes, then if you track the magnetization of the magnet, it has this leak and integrate properties that you have in a spiking neuron. The key point, therefore, and even if you look at the intrinsic device physics, for instance, a magnetization profile is given by something which is called Landau-Lifshitz-Gilbert-Slonczewski equation. And if I look at the temporal evolution of the magnetization of the device, DMDT, that is now related to its initial magnetization as well as an external current input, which very much maps to leaky integrate fire equations that you consider. So therefore, The point being that we have a whole bunch of devices right now where it is now possible to have a one-to-one mapping between the computational primitive and the hardware. Next, we have another bottleneck which is coming from the architecture side of things. So conventionally, the way von Neumann architecture is designed is you have memory storage and you have processing cores, and then you have data transactions between your memory and processing. Now, AI applications being hugely memory dominated, for more complex data sets where you, if you see this graph over here, the complexity of the data set is increasing from the left to the right. And as I'm going for more complex data sets, the amount of memory that I will have in my neural network model is increasing. And therefore, I can easily end up spending more than more than 50% of the energy consumption in the memory access and memory leakage. So can we avoid this bottleneck? The answer is yes. So these are some of the magnetic tunnel junction or spintronic devices that I was just showing in the previous slide. Note that these are non-volatile devices in the sense that if I turn off the power, I will retain their state. So these are memory devices. And by very simple application of Ohm's law and Kirchhoff's law, we are able to implement dot product in these areas. For instance, if I have an input voltage coming over here, the current flowing through this cross point is going to be the product of the voltage and the conductance that I have programmed in the device. And all these currents are going to get summed up along the column, implementing the dot product. So these in-memory computing systems where I'm able to embed the dot product function inherently in the memory array is very much beneficial for hardware acceleration of these neural networks, where also we need the dot product as a computing kernel. So more or less, I would say that this serves as kind of the key motivation behind some of our research works. And going ahead, I'm going to delve a bit deeper into each of the specific topics. So first up is on the algorithm side. So let's discuss a bit on how people have been trying to envision training spiking neural networks. Now, these are very different than standard deep learning algorithms in the sense that, first of all, there's time-based operations which you need to account for. Second is there is event-driven operations. So therefore, you need to do backpropagation, etc., on binary spiking events, and therefore you end up facing discontinuities while calculating gradients and so on. So some of the methods, the popular methods that people have been trying to work with, for instance, range from unsupervised learning all the way to supervised learning. So for instance, if I look at unsupervised learning systems, a classical method for training spiking neural networks has been something which is called spike timing dependent plasticity, where the strength of a synapse that is connecting various neurons is modulated based on the spiking activity of the connecting neurons. So this is the graph you are showing over here, where the change in synaptic weight is a function of the spike timing difference. This is positive spike timing difference, and therefore the receiving neuron is spiking after the transmitting neuron, and therefore you're potentiating the synaptic weight and so on. Key takeaway being that one of the key advantages of this kind of approach is you do not need any labeled data, which is very much useful in edge applications where I may not have a human annotator in real time. However, the accuracy of these networks, of course, will not be as good as backpropagation trained networks, for instance, because that is supervised learning. Another advantage over here is that you have local learning, in the sense that backpropagation is a global learning method where your errors are backpropagated through the network. So global information is needed, whereas over here you only need local information. Now, second of all, you can do backpropagation through time, where the main idea is I'm unrolling the network over time and I'm really trying to backpropagate the gradients through the network. Problem is, of course, time-based unrolling is computationally expensive, along with the fact that you have discontinuities in the gradient calculation process. So people have been trying to use surrogate gradient techniques and so on. And the third approach is conversion schemes where you train a standard deep learning network and then you convert it to a spiking network for event driven inference. So over here, I'm taking advantage of standard deep learning training methods, but losing out from the perspective that usually these conversion methods have several constraints and therefore the accuracy is sometimes limited by that. So our group has been looking at leveraging several insights from standard deep learning and trying to improve the performance, the algorithmic performance of these systems. Um, we were, for instance, one of the first groups to really report performance of these spiking neural networks through a conversion approach on large scale data sets like ImageNet, and showcasing that you can potentially get an order of magnitude energy improvement in comparison to standard deep learning networks. Now, some of the recent works that we have been doing in our group, for instance, is how can we bypass, let's say, training the network through BPTT? Can we convert the network and then fine tune some of the specific properties we have in the spiking domain, like thresholds, for instance, um, in a much more resource efficient fashion. So one possible alternative is to look at a hybrid neuroevolutionary based approach. So neuroevolutionary optimized networks is a growing research field where the main advantage is that I'm optimizing various parameters of my deep network based on a gradient free mechanism like differential evolution or so on. I'm using really a gradient free optimizer to um, get to the minima. And therefore, the advantage over here is we are avoiding any surrogate gradient problems that we need in a BPTT based training approach, let's say. So using such a neuroevolutionary optimized framework, we were really able to show that you can even get better accuracies. The orange one is the graph over here, than other training approaches like backpropagation through time or even a conversion based approach. And the one of the key motivation is that I'm not needing the huge amount of memory usage that I face when I'm doing BPTT based training, because there you need to store the entire computational graph. So we observed around 2.9x less memory and 42x less running time in this case. Now, that's well and good, we get optimized thresholds for the network, but is that really making any sense? Why are individual layers needing to be optimized separately? So we try to interpret the optimized thresholds, and interestingly enough, depending on the application, you can have different insights. So for instance, over here you are seeing that I'm plotting in the blue graph principal components that I get from different layers of a network. So in a deep network, each layer is really trying to project the data into a higher dimension. And therefore, as you are going deeper into the network, a more important layer should try to project the data into more number of principal components. So what I'm really plotting over here is the changes in the principal component, and you are seeing that the percentage change, the thresholds optimized also follow a similar pattern. And that stems from the fact that a more important layer should therefore have a higher threshold to really achieve better accuracies. Same thing for adversarial attack. So we tried to also evaluate this approach in an adversarial attack based scenario. And we are seeing, if I plot the adversarial noise sensitivity of different layers of the network, I'm seeing that as my noise sensitivity increases, the thresholds reduce. And that is because the effect of the threshold is really to induce a discretization effect on the neuron activations. And lower the threshold, more number of discrete states I have. Now, it turns out discretization is also related to adversarial robustness. There have been works that have shown that if you were to discretize a neural network, then higher noise sensitivity is associated with reduced precision. So therefore, that pattern also makes sense. And so it's an application-driven interpretability that you can potentially achieve using this kind of optimization process, and this can really be extended for other spiking neuron specific parameters like leak properties and so on. I'm going to skip this work uh, because we are running out of time kind of, but The another important work that we have been trying to do is to look at the scaling the performance of unsupervised spiking networks, which has remained a challenge so far. So for instance, the idea over here is in a randomly initialized conv net, can we use the output of the conv net to really pass it through an HTTP based clustering mechanism, which I was mentioning in some of the slides before, and use the pseudo labels to generate the backpropagation gradients for this network. So you're doing backpropagation not based on the labels that you're getting from the data set, but really on outputs that you're clustering with HTTP, and this is kind of working in loop. And we have been able to show really good accuracies on data sets of the order of tiny ImageNet and so on. So that's hopefully gives you a snippet of some of the research works in our group trying to leverage insights from conventional deep learning. Now, we have been also trying to revisit how we can rethink fundamentally how spiking neural networks work, because these are, as I mentioned, a significant shift from standard deep learning. So, in terms of that perspective, we have been trying to formulate spiking neural networks as dynamical systems and more looking as SNNs or spiking neural networks as energy based models. The idea that neuron states collectively converge to equilibrium points based on input data to better explain the input data has been a popular hypothesis. And in light of that, two specific approaches that we have been looking at in our group are, first of all, something which I'll be talking about, which is equilibrium propagation. Another one is implicit differentiation. And using these two techniques, we are really trying to gain two advantages. First of all, scaling up local learning, because HTTP, as I mentioned, is limited in accuracies. And second of all, can we really extend spiking networks to beyond vision tasks like NLP and so on? So first, let me talk about equilibrium propagation then. So equilibrium propagation is mainly based on energy based modeling of the learning process, where I have state transition dynamics of the form shown here, where st plus 1 is essentially the neuronal states at time t plus 1 dependent on the current state. Theta is the model parameter, x is the input, phi is a scalar primitive function which represents the energy function that I'm trying to minimize. So these kind of networks operate in two phases. One is the free phase, where I will have the transition dynamics that I talked about. It evolves to an equilibrium point, which is S star. And following that, I have a nudge phase where I implicitly perturb the synaptic weights locally using this kind of transition dynamics. You see over here, L is the loss function essentially. So these two phases are operated sequentially, and post nudge phase, the weights are updated using this equation. Advantages of EP are the fact, as I mentioned, local learning, you do not face any non-differentiability problems relating to surrogate gradient, etc. Third thing is backpropagation requires two kinds of circuits during its operation, whereas equilibrium propagation is requiring only one computational circuit during both the phases. And I probably mentioned this right before, that it has local in space and time updates. So all well and good, but what's the challenge? So these kind of networks so far have primarily been used for static tasks, and the input is really not time varying. So one of the works that we focused on recently is, can we extend the operation of EP trained networks to sequential tasks? So for instance, over here, the key idea was to gain insights from modern Hopfield networks. So modern Hopfield networks is emerging to be very similar to attention mechanism that we see in transformers. And over here, you are seeing that the energy function of a modern Hopfield network, where I have x1 to xn, let's say, to be the stored patterns, epsilon is the, sorry, eta is the state pattern, and n is the total number of stored patterns, m is the largest norm. Using this kind of energy function, which has log square exponential, it is possible to show that modern Hopfield networks can potentially provide exponential amount of storage of patterns, and also through a single step convergence you can show that the retrieved pattern is going to look something like this. And this interestingly have similarities with a with an attention module that people usually consider in transformers, as you are seeing over here, q being the query, k being the key, and dk being the encoding dimension. So q over here represents the state pattern, and key k can be considered to be the stored pattern. So therefore, can we really merge the two concepts? Can we use Hopfill networks being an energy-based attention mechanism to integrate with the energy-based transition dynamics? And can we really show that we have convergence of these networks, equivalence to BPTT-based training, and so on? So what you are seeing over here is a timing diagram where over time, I am really trying to operate the network, and the initial weight layer that we have connecting to the input is being treated as a projection layer, and the output of that is provided as the query, and the key is essentially the input X. The initial input layer has this Hopfill attention mechanism being performed, which is using this kind of state transition dynamic, only difference being that I have a Hopfill attention module associated with it. We have been able to show that these are representative of three specific weights that we have in the network, and you can see that it is equivalent to backpropagation through time-based updates. And this shows that over time, the energy function of the network, or the scalar primitive function, is also optimized. This is actually one of our recent works in IJCAI, where we demonstrated the performance on data sets like IMDb and SNLI, which is a natural language inference task. And you can also extend this to architectures that require cross attention. So for instance, in the SNLI dataset, there's pair of sentences, and you really need to find the relationship between the two, which is the premise and the hypothesis. And you can really extend these architectures very simple-minded fashion to these kind of cross attention based systems. That's some of the results in terms of accuracy. As you are seeing, the EP trained networks are performing at par or better than prior approaches for LSTMs and GRUs on these two specific data sets. And really, as I mentioned, our advantage is that we now have a local learning scheme which is not suffering from gradient non-differentiability problems that we typically have in spiking networks. Okay, so that's one thrust that I was mentioning on local learning. Another task is to really try to extend the performance of spiking networks in natural language processing tasks, right? And that is a significant challenge, because training spiking networks on standard vision based tasks itself is cumbersome, because you are really unrolling the network over time. So how can we really scale this to NLP level, right? So one particular theorem which we kind of drew inspiration from is in the domain of deep equilibrium models, where implicit modeling has been used to train really infinite depth residual networks, where spatially, let's say, as your neural states are converging, for instance, if I'm trying to optimize a fixed point equation of the form of z equals to f theta z, where f theta denotes a particular network, a particular layer's weight, and z is the input to the layer, and so you are passing it through f theta, and in an infinitely deep residual network, therefore, after some point in time, the spatial responses will converge, and therefore, I am trying to optimize a function of this form, essentially trying to minimize this g theta z to be equal to 0. And therefore, people have shown that in this kind of equations, minimizing the loss function is equivalent to solving this equation where you are really optimizing based on the steady state function z star. So assuming that z is converging to z star at equilibrium, I can perform backpropagation by just backpropagating through the final converged state. So I do not need to consider the intermediate states. Now, this is well and good if we can interpret the spatial treatment in the temporal domain. So, if I were to train a spiking network, if I am able to show that the spiking response of my neurons in the network converges over time, then I can really use this implicit differentiation theorem to backpropagate on the final converged average spiking rate instead of the temporal variations that we have at each time step. That enables us to avoid all the bottlenecks that we have with respect to backpropagation through time. So that was really the key motivation. Here you are seeing model architecture for spiking BERT, and as you are seeing that we have attention modules, normalization layers, and so on, along with also feedback connections. And we have been able to show that in these kind of networks, for if you observe over various time steps, the mean spiking rate converges over time. So we do have this convergence property, and therefore because we have convergence to an equilibrium state, we can therefore invoke the implicit differentiation theorem and use a fixed point equation to really describe the operation of that layer and do backpropagation based on that final converged state. Another key property that we leveraged is that because you have convergence to such equilibrium states, you're also able to perform knowledge distillation in these networks. So we used a larger sized BERT model where general distillation was performed over data set like Wikipedia, and then you are transferring that information to a smaller spiking BERT model. So we did perform both general and task specific distillation. This represents some of our results. As you are seeing, the mean ASR per layer is showing differences with respect to the normalization operation. We performed some amount of ablation studies for that, given that it is a non-linear operator and therefore it was not clear whether the spiking rate would really converge to equilibrium for such networks. Also, with increase in the number of encoder layers, you also have increase in the accuracy. These kind of spiking BERT systems therefore give us a very um, flexible control knob to get more energy efficiency out of the system. For instance, as you are spending more time steps, the accuracy improves, but the energy efficiency also reduces because you have more time steps, right? So I have power advantage, but if I need to wait longer, I'm burning more power slowly. So this gives us a very nice control knob to decide on what is an optimal accuracy at which we get an energy efficiency. So for instance, over here, we have been able to show almost 2 being the energy efficiency factor with respect to a normal BERT implementation, ISO architecture. So these are some of the results that we have, and competitive with prior works on BERT models as well as tiny BERT models specific to resource constrained environments. This is the first spiking implementation of a language model to be really evaluated on the glue benchmark. There I will stop in terms of the algorithm side. From the hardware side, as I was saying, that we are looking at a whole bunch of devices. I will keep things short. So one of the specific devices that we look at, for instance, is that of a magnetic tunnel junction, where by passing current through the two layers, I am able to program the conductance of the device. And these are very useful because, for instance, you are seeing over here the same MTJ with a more complex device structure of a domain wall. The key motivation is by passing current through these devices, I'm able to program the domain wall at various locations and read out multiple programmable conductive states through the device. Now, these devices are very low power. They can be operated at only a few femtojoules, and we have been working on implementing these kind of in-memory computing systems. As I was showing, each layer of the network can really be mapped into a cross array of these devices. And we have been able to show that you can potentially achieve an order of magnitude more energy efficiency in comparison to an ANN, and almost 2 orders of magnitude energy efficiency in comparison to an SNN built with other popular post CMOS technology. So one of the specific reasons we are focusing on ferromagnetic and ferroelectric devices in our group are really to tap into the energy efficiency of these devices. Another particular devices I was talking about are ferroelectric devices. One specific thrust is on ferroelectric field effect transistors. The industry is really excited about this because this fits into the conventional structure of a field effect transistor that people have been looking at, except for the fact that the gate dielectric, the hafnium dioxide, is ferroelectric. So by passing different programming voltages through the device, I am able to program multiple conductive states. And in one of our recent works, we actually showed that there is a good amount of non-linearity present in the device. So if I were to program this device, delta G, to be a function of the initial conductance of the device as a function of spike timing, I do see that there is a state dependence, there is a non-linearity involved. And all of this people have so far really treated as a disadvantage, whereas we tried to show that if you were to tap into this intrinsic nonlinear device physics, you can potentially reduce a good amount of the training samples, almost 33% fewer training samples than conventional approaches. So once again underscoring the critical need for hardware software co-design. So the experimental effort on ferromagnetic devices, we do it in our group. We fabricate devices at the Materials Research Institute. You are seeing over here an SEM image for these spintronic devices. The characterization is done in our own group. Whereas for ferroelectrics, we are part of a DOE FRC on 3D ferroelectric microelectronics, where we collaborate with a whole bunch of other university groups as well as industrial partners like Global Foundries to look at a whole gamut of ferroelectric devices ranging from tunnel junctions to ferroelectric capacitors and so on. Now, another important thrust in our group has been to compute with noise. And as you are scaling these devices down, one particular observation that we have is that we have cycle to cycle variations in the device. And therefore, the key idea over here is, can we really leverage this cycle to cycle variation for computing purpose? And given that we are almost nearing time, I will quickly go to one of my later slide on Bayesian neural networks. So one particular application that people have been looking at is Bayesian deep learning. And for instance, over here, you are seeing that a Bayesian deep network is being applied on the network input to predict the image depth. And you are seeing that this is the network depth output, and this is the estimated uncertainty. And the network is highly uncertain over the reflective edges of the car, for instance. So this is all well and good. We have a nice application that can be very much advantageous for safety critical applications like self-driving cars, as I mentioned. But how do we implement this in hardware? Because each of the synaptic weights, instead of being a fixed value, is now a Gaussian probability distribution. So I will need to do dot products with Gaussian random number generators. Now, interestingly enough, as I mentioned, these devices are stochastic, and therefore at room temperature, because of thermal noise, if I operate the device, I can bias it such that it has 50% switching probability. And using central limit theorem, if I were to add, let's say, the outputs of a bunch of these random number generators, I can potentially end up getting a Gaussian distribution. So over here you are seeing with two uniform random number generators, I don't see a Gaussian curve, but with around 8, let's say, it's kind of starting to mimic a Gaussian distribution. So we have been able to show that using such Bayesian neural networks, leveraging the device stochasticity, you get around an order of magnitude energy improvement, 24x specifically, in comparison to a CMOS based implementation. Now, one particular final perspective that we have not touched about is neuroscience inspiration. So yes, when we talk about spiking neural networks, we do think of temporal behavior, spiking behavior, and so on. But is that all? Can we get more insights from how the brain works? And the answer is yes. If you think of some of the computational primitives that we have in the brain, there is still very limited understanding on how we can leverage those insights from the computational side. So one specific cell that we are targeting in our group is something which is called astrocytes. And astrocytes are a type of glial cells that contribute more than 50% of the cells in our brain. And they perform a whole bunch of functionalities like self repair, temporal information binding, and so on. However, its role in the domain of neuromorphic computing still remains understudied. So recently we have been looking at how astrocytes work. So for instance, over here you are seeing a cartoon where this is in the perspective of self-repair. So if I have two neurons, astrocytes communicate information between the neurons through two chemical messengers which are called DAC and ESP. And interestingly enough, it turns out that if I have a particular neuron which is firing at a particular frequency, and let's say at a specific instant of time, 200 seconds, I have a fault in one of the synapses, one of the chemicals, DAC, that reduces. Okay, so it is showing increase over here because it is in the negative scale. So DAC actually reduces down. And this is a local information. However, the other chemical ESP is actually a global signal. And therefore, if all the other neurons in my network are healthy and firing at the baseline rate, that will communicate that the ESP is actually high, and a synapse transmission probability, which is termed as PR over here, that is actually a function of DAC and ESP. And through those two mechanisms, it tries to increase the PR of the healthy synapses to get our firing rate to the baseline level. So the key idea was, can we use such a functionality for autonomous self-repair of neuromorphic hardware? So when I try to look at neuromorphic hardware, some of the devices that I talked about, they do have faults, they do have various kinds of non-idealities like conductance drifts and so on. And can we mitigate such effects by incorporating astrocyte-based self-repair mechanisms? And we did develop such a local learning algorithm. As you see over here, the PR as a function of time follows exponential curve. This is the exponential behavior that you are seeing. The PR of the healthy synapse is trying to increase after a fault. And that we found out through computational modeling is actually related inversely to Z, Z being the fault severity, which is equal to the sum of the healthy synaptic weights, the ratio before and after fault. Using this kind of modeling, we were able to develop a local learning rule which is local to the neuron and synapse and does self-repair. And we were able to show that considering this kind of temporal dynamics of the self-repair process, you are actually able to increase the accuracy, recover much of the accuracy that you lost because of the faults, and the training convergence is also faster. Right? So this is one of our recent works in AAA. We are also working actively on various other aspects that astrocytes are enabling, in addition to also looking at novelties in network architecture. Can we go beyond convolutional architectures? One focus has been to look at dynamic networks that grows and shrinks over time to deal with lifelong learning and so on. So in summary, our group is really trying to pursue a very interdisciplinary end-to-end perspective across the computing stack, going all the way from algorithms to hardware design to how you're sensing the information. I also didn't discuss today about some of our works into event-driven sensing, where you can sense information in only when pixels are changing over time, let's say, and how you can leverage such sensing mechanisms as well. And we really try to combine knowledge going all the way from material science, novel devices to new kinds of AI algorithms, application drivers, and finally, all of this is tied under the broad umbrella of getting more insights from computational neuroscience. And a huge shout out to all my students and postdocs, and also to our sponsors. Thank you. This is where I would like to stop. And many of our works are already open sourced in our group's GitHub page. So I encourage you to check that out in case